Well, I know they can find
Well,
out.
Senator, we can certainly look into that. We don't know the individual circumstances, but I'm sure that's not the only example that something like that would come up. So we will explore that and see what we can find out for you.
Thank you.
Representative Carnevale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Sharon and Peter. Sharon, on slide 34. Slide 34 dealt with municipal pension ideas for independence. And the end goal was to move troubled local plans into the MERS. And it says once that was done, they would manage benefit changes until funded at target ratios, establish permanent benefit limits, and abolish selected features of local plans. Did that advisory group speak to any of the legal minds about the legality of tampering with ongoing collective bargaining agreements?
So these options here were presented by a couple of the members who were tasked with looking into this. So I would not characterize it as the advisory group's sort of recommendation. And I understood these to be independent of each other. So you wouldn't do the first one and then the next few. So just to clarify that. But to your point on the legality, that certainly is an issue that the advisory group is aware of. And as I mentioned, when the treasurer and the actuary came to both chambers to present, they included a bit in their presentation on the extra legal hurdles regarding contracts. So it wasn't extensively discussed in the advisory group, but based on those other presentations, we know that they're keenly aware of those additional hurdles.
But no answers?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Senator
Thank you, Mr.
Palmer.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Peter and Sharon, thank you very much. As expected, your presentations and the work over the last three meetings have been both comprehensive and cohesive, so thank you very much for doing that. So two questions. On page 28 is the first question, where we talk to the combination of levers. I know I've seen a fair amount with it talks to the, I'll say the mortality rate or the mortality date of the population, the aging population, being in the neighborhood of, if I recall correctly, whether it was 2026 or maybe it was further out. That, I assume that's factored into here, so that's why the numbers move the way they do? That's the first question.
When they played with these levers, they kept the other assumptions the same, so that you wouldn't have additional play in the numbers.
Okay. And the last question has to do, and I brought this up the last time when we met, all the work that's here is associated with the pension side of things and potential levers to ensure there's security, sustainability, affordability, all those things that the General Treasurer is looking to move forward with. The other piece that's still out there is the OPEB side of the world. And I'm not sure it pales in comparison to this, but it's still a number in the B's. So it's a large number that's out there. Can we expect, should we expect that there's going to be levers as well that will help us address to ensure we have security, sustainability, affordability across the entire gamut, given that that's a fair amount of the, I'll say, unfunded liability, not just the pension side, but the OPEB side?
Senator, I do think that as members of the advisory group, they did recognize the significance of OPEB. Given the limited time that they had and the task that they were laid out to do, they did not discuss at length any initiatives related to specifically the trying to resolve the multi-billion-dollar unfunded liability you're facing with OPEB. One of the other aspects of it is that I guess you can say that's not a provision of the state's retirement system. So there's a lot more flexibility as to how you can attack this issue down the road. Municipalities also vary considerably, and they face the similar issues on the pension side as they do addressing the OPEB issue. And in some instances, their OPEB liability far exceeds their unfunded pension liability. And so they will need to begin developing plans to begin developing other trust funds, as you're well aware, and working with those items as well as others. But they certainly did not take up the OPEB issue in this particular exercise.
Just to follow, Mr. Chairman, if I may, do we expect the General Treasurer to bring forward is an expectation that the overall plan proposal that will come forward will have OPEB as a piece of that to ensure we have that addressed as well.
Well, I certainly can't speak for the treasurer, but indications from where the advisory group was directed to look at, I don't expect to see the OPEB, particularly given the general treasurer's responsibilities are strictly related to the retirement system. So OPEB would go beyond where I think the scope of work that was implied and where he
So it would be
began.
incumbent upon us then to ensure it gets addressed.
I believe so, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Earhart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And once again, thank you, Sharon and Peter, for another excellent presentation. If I could just ask a question, please, about slide 26. Your replacement value comparisons, which I found very interesting, because as I understand it, under the current, if I read this correctly, under the current plan, a retiree, including their Social Security, would in fact be at 108% of their retirement salary. I have some concern, though, about whether averages can be dangerous. And as you know, Social Security is not a linear system. At lower income levels, much of your Social Security income is not subject to income tax. At higher income levels, you cap out, so you're not that number is not riding all the way up. So I would be very interested if offline and also when we come in with impact statements of the plan that are made, if this same sort of analysis could be done, but perhaps breaking it out and taking 2 or 3 categories, because my gut feel is that if you put it all on a fully leveraged pre-tax basis, that 108% average would probably be a lot higher for a low-income person than it would be for a high-income person, just because of the non-linearity of Social Security. And so that's a hypothesis I have. I'd be very interested in seeing if we could test that on 1 or 2 calculations, and also would recommend that we carry that through in the presentation of whatever is put forward. Thank you.
There was a good deal of discussion on the range of Social Security replacement as it related to earnings. So, I mean, a lot of these represent midpoints or averages, as you point out. We will attempt to get that sort of greater detail in any future presentations.
Representative Riley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real briefly, Sharon and Pete, the possible framework that you outlined on slide 23 and then the ramifications of that in slide 24, I understand that this is just for the state employees. Has the group run the same sorts of calculations using a hybrid type plan like that for all of the other plans, where we could see potential savings and, I mean, just as importantly, the out-year contribution rates and how that would be affected if we included all of the other plans?
The advisory group was shown to a limited extent some of what it might look like for state employees and teachers, and you saw briefly the public safety MERS example. So they did run through a number of scenarios that they would consider. Clearly, when you look at state employees and teachers, the extent of the impact is similar because they're similarly sized pension systems and similar number of participants. And the cost or the savings implications actually kind of play similar to each other. So you can get a good feel for that fairly easily. The MERS information was not as readily available in the discussions because there was only so much they could cover within 4 meetings, I think is probably the reason,
Sure.
rather than not being able to run the numbers.
The other question I would have then off of that would be, so I guess along those lines, they weren't able to run calculations along those lines, say, for municipal plans that are outside of MERS, police or fire, the state teachers and that sort of thing. So we don't really know what the potential savings could be to municipalities if they were to enact changes along those lines.
They did do the teachers, so I don't want to leave you with the impression that
Okay.
they didn't. In fact, there was a one slide that sort of did the same thing, showed the impact. Magnitude is relatively the same. So then they like we showed you, they did the MERS police and fire. I don't think we got a slide on the MERS themselves, but that impact would vary greatly, as you know, because they're all calculated individually, their funded
Right.
status. But in most scenarios, well, there'd be a savings.
Yeah, and then, so I guess I'm kind of answering this question, but I'll ask it anyways. The last few slides where you discussed some little things that they touched on briefly but didn't go into in a lot of detail, I'm assuming then that we don't exactly have the savings that would be calculated if we were to enact certain things like, well, fiscal notes for, say, buyouts of poorly funded plans, things like that.
Exactly.
On the local level. And then the changes they were referring to in disability pensions, the service credit purchases, and part-time work. They just kind of touched on that. We don't have any fiscal notes associated with those.
Yep, the locals, as you probably remember,
They weren't really touched at all.
from last week.
Yeah.
I don't think they could even begin to start calculating that. As far as the little items, I'm not aware that they've calculated them. I think they were put out there to say, don't forget there are these other smaller but perhaps not insignificant items that might need to be considered, but there wasn't a great deal of time spent at massaging the numbers.
Sure,
and
sure.
nothing was presented to the group that we're aware of that showed examples of what you could save.
Yeah.
Representative, one other thing to keep in
Absolutely.
note is, over the last 3 years, we've had the Auditor General producing that report, particularly focused on the non-MERS local plans. And it's only been recently that we've been able to get a fairly comprehensive view as to what's going on there. And even with that information, it's limited because, as you saw from the recommendations, audits aren't conducted on all of those local plans. And so to get a good handle as to where they really stand, you'd have to get another layer of detail. So while the state plans and the MERS plans, we have a level of certainty as to what may or may not happen with the data, the local plans, it's a lot of unknowns involved with dealing with those plans.
I would just say one of my concerns of the advisory group and the work they've done is I don't think we've placed enough emphasis on the local plans and how important they are, as well as the state plans. I understand that's under the direct purview of the treasurer, and that's why it was kind of natural that they focus on that. But especially last week, some of the slides we looked at with the out-year projections, we look at the out-year projections because we have to budget for them, and they look awful with the money we're going to have to be budgeting for pensions. But if you look at the cities and towns and what they're supposed to be doing, and they have extremely limited revenue bases, I'm just really concerned that if they're not brought into the solution, that we're really doing a great disservice to them, and we're going to force them to really make some tough decisions. So I guess we'll wait and see what the final recommendations are, and if they can give us some numbers and give us perhaps a little more flexibility and some ideas we could perhaps extend to them. But thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Valencia and then Representative Carnevale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Peter, Sharon, thank you very much. Before I get started on my question, I would like to I agree with Representative Riley. It seems like the municipal plans are getting kind of short shrift in terms of analysis, and I'm very concerned about the municipal plans as well. Because I haven't been looking at this stuff for a long time, I was surprised last year or earlier this year to learn that 50% of the teachers don't get any Social Security. And it was always my understanding that the whole idea of retirement was, was a three-legged stool with Social Security, a pension from your job, and then whatever savings that you can amass privately. That was the scheme. That was how the middle class was built. How did we end up with 50% of our teachers not participating in Social Security? And are we trending upwards or downwards? Is that something that's being, is that kind of been steady state now for some time?
There's I believe, a one-time option to choose on the employer's part whether or not to participate. Remember, there's a contribution on both the employer's side and the employee's side. And
so these are the school committees making this decision, and then and the
I'm
teacher.
not exactly sure which body would have made the decision, but it's not just the teachers, so public safety employees also.
Right.
So I think it's probably consistent by town as the employer, not necessarily a variance among school committees. I'd have to confirm that, but I believe that's the case.
And do we know which direction we're going in? Are more, is this number going up or down?
Well, the number of communities is fixed right now, unless a community opts in. I don't believe you can opt out now, but if you could opt in to Social Security.
Right.
So the real question becomes, are those communities those that have a growing number of employees or a shrinking number of employees? And that I don't know. And I don't know what that, we'll try and get some data for you. We've never had a great handle on exactly how many employees
I would love
in.
to see them start opting in, but that's.
Well, if
that's
I could
me.
just, I guess one point is, you know, for a municipality, if there is the option to opt in, they would also correspondingly increase their payroll costs with the employer contribution into Social Security. So it's
No,
as
no,
much
I understand. I understand that it would be an increase in cost both for the employer and the employee, but I just think it makes sense when you look at these final numbers and the security part of Social Security. I think it makes sense. Thank you. Thank you,
Before
Mr.
I
Chairman.
go over to Representative Carnevale, on slide 19, just I guess on that point, that was the question that I was going to ask. I don't know how hard and specific those percentages are, but it's just for the sake of the conversation, like Rep. Valencia just mentioned, if the numbers generally work out to a third, a third, a third, according to a retirement income stream based on a hybrid. So a third of a retiree's benefit would come from the defined benefit, a third would come from what they've amassed in defined contribution, and the remaining part, Social Security. For those municipalities that don't participate in Social Security, did the advisory group look at how that lack of Social Security would be compensated for? So I guess what's frustrating about this whole pension issue is that not only do we have, you know, a significant number of plans, but you've got just differences in benefit structures. You know, Social Security or lack thereof is just one of them. You've got different, you know, when you get into the local plans, you've got different minimum years of service, accrual rates. I mean, it's all, you know, kind of scattered all over the place. And while we would like to, as part of a pension reform, or at least it's my opinion, you know, I think one of the goals of a pension reform would be to try to create as uniform a system as possible. How do you do that when you have such big discrepancies like the lack of Social Security, which, according to a hybrid type solution, is a third of your potential retirement income?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I do think you bring up a good point, and the advisory group did discuss what solutions or what options might be available to try and address those that do not participate in Social Security. And as Sharon went through the presentation, I believe she put up the slide relating to the MERS police and fire plan. And in that discussion, the actuary laid out some options as to should any of these employees not participate, is there a way you can adjust the employee and the employer contribution rates to their DC plan, their defined contribution plan, to try and make up some of that difference to bring them close to that 65 to 80% range once you're looking at trying to hit that income replacement target. So it certainly was an element of the discussion, particularly obviously on the MERS side, and it was similarly how it would affect those teachers that may not be participating in the plan.
Thank you. Representative Carnevale?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sharon and Peter, over the last, I believe, 5 years, state workers and teachers have received 3 different sets of cuts to their pensions. Most of us believe there was a certain dollar amount that those 3 sets of cuts saved the taxpayers of the state. Recently, the Providence Journal reported that was mostly untrue. Do we know the amount of dollars that those cuts did save the taxpayers?
I know we have not sort of tried to update the baseline calculation, because oftentimes what we'll do is, what's the impact to the structural budget? So what's the 1 year, it might have been $30 million, and that's sort of set in the budget structure. And then the next year, if it's another 20, you know, you could probably add the two together and say, well, the one set of changes plus the next set of changes would be a structural impact of maybe 50. The hard part is that as the assumptions change, you could go back and recalculate those numbers. The impact's higher, it's lower. you know what I mean? So the other difficult thing is the impact in the 2008